this is a story that has been brewing for well over a year now. We're talking about the civil war in Sudan. Fire used as a weapon of war in Sudan as entire towns and villages burned to the ground, NBC reports. Hundreds of towns and villages across Sudan have been burned to the ground, and the fires were likely man-made, satellite images and open-source reporting show. The result of a brutal civil war that has been raging in the Northeast African nation for over a year. Bitter fighting between the forces of two rival generals has laid waste to much of the country. Thousands have been slaughtered, and 10 million people have been driven from their homes, creating the world's largest displacement crisis, according to the United Nations Migration Agency. And as the fighting has spread, homes and aid camps have been burned out by fires that have been started intentionally, experts and analysts say. When we see reports of fighting coinciding with clusters of fires, it indicates that fire may be being used as a weapon of war, Mark Sneck, an open-source investigator, told NBC News on Monday. More than 50 settlements have burned repeatedly, suggesting intent and possible forced displacement, added Sneck, who, along with his colleagues, has been tracking the blazes by satellite at the Center for Information Resilience, abbreviated CIR, a nonprofit organization dedicated to exposing rights abuses and war crimes. Relying in part on heat-sensing satellites developed by NASA to monitor wildfires around the world, Sneck and the team of researchers from CIR's Sudan Witness Project have documented more than 235 fires that have broken out in towns and villages across the country since the start of the war in April 2023. Combining this with open-source reporting, cross-checking social media content, maps, and other publicly available data, they are able to determine the scope of the destruction across the country, which sits at the crossroads of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, and is home to both African and Arab populations, with Arabic being the most widely spoken language. CIR found much of the violence was taking place in Darfur, Sudan's westernmost region. The latest data shows fire events moving closer and into El Fasher, the capital of Sudan's North Darfur state and home to 1.5 million people, including many who have fled from the other embattled parts of the country. It is also the last major city in Darfur where the military has a presence and has become the focal point of the latest fighting between the war's combatants. The region has become a flashpoint in the war that broke out in April 2023 between the Sudanese military, controlled by the country's top commander and de facto ruler, General Abdel Fattah Burhan, and his former deputy, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's referred to as Hemeti, a former camel dealer widely known as Hemeti, who leads the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, commonly referred to, as the RSF. Both men were leaders in a counterinsurgency against an uprising in Sudan's Darfur region, a conflict that in 2005 saw dictator Omar al-Bashir become the world's first sitting leader to be indicted by the ICC on suspicion of genocide. Then they were part of the military establishment that helped oust al-Bashir in 2019 after widespread popular unrest. 2 years later, they agreed to rule together in an alliance that saw the military seize power in a coup following the collapse of the Western-backed government of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok in 2021. But the alliance between the two military leaders spectacularly broke down over how to manage the transition to a civilian government, and with neither seemingly willing to cede power to the other, a war broke out. Since then, at least 15,000 people have been killed, according to a UN report in April, which said that around 18 million people are facing acute hunger. And so the United Nations put out a report yesterday, nowhere is safe for civilians as Sudan war descends further into chaos. The war that erupted last April between the SAF and the RSF has triggered political instability, a severe humanitarian emergency, and widespread human rights violations. Over 15,000 fatalities have been reported in some 1,400 violent incidents targeting civilians, and there are now almost 9.5 million forcibly displaced in Sudan, 7.3 million internally, and 1.9 million in neighboring countries. Furthermore, around 18 million people are acutely food insecure, and 5 million are facing starvation. pregnant women are most at risk, and 7,000 new mothers could die in the next few months if they do not get access to food and health care. Ambassadors also heard an update from Idem Wasorno, the Director of Operations at the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, who detailed the impact of the crisis on civilians and on relief efforts. Though there have been some improvements over the last few weeks in access, such as approvals of visas and travel permits by authorities, aid operations continue to face serious challenges, including attacks against personnel. 6 aid workers, all Sudanese nationals, have been killed over the last 6 weeks. This brings the total number of aid workers killed to 24 since the war started, Ms. Wasarnu said. In addition, the $2.7 billion UN-led humanitarian appeal is woefully underfunded, she added, noting that so far only $441 million, just 16%, has been received. We are in a race against time to avert massive loss of life in this unprecedented protection and food security crisis in Sudan. Every day that we wait for funding to come in, more lives are at risk, she warned. So here is a piece of a PBS segment. This was aired a couple of weeks ago from Sudan.
Do you think that the international community has let you down?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think so. I think that people eyes now on Ukraine and Gaza, but we got not a lot of help here in Sudan. Basically, people need food and medicine, basically. Okay?
Food and medicine, as simple as that?
As simple as that.
Because in war, you see the best as well as the worst of humankind. The best being people like Dr. Mohammed Banaga, who started a soup kitchen for displaced people, funded by local shops and friends in the Sudanese diaspora. And you stayed here throughout the war. Were you not afraid?
No, I'm not afraid. Afraid of what?
Afraid of being killed?
Man will die once, no? Nose to eyes once.
The United Nations tweets out, this was on the 18th, the people of Sudan are crying for help to restore their dignity and rights. Speaking at the Human Rights Council, the chair of the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan, Mohammed Chande Athman, called for the fighting to stop. Here's a piece of his address.
Sudan has been engulfed in a devastating conflict for over a year now, characterized largely by its urban, widespread nature and its civilian population placed at the center of extreme violence. Blatant disregard for fundamental human rights and international humanitarian law has led to killings, looting, mass displacement, rape and other forms of sexual violence, and resulted in a grave humanitarian crisis with around 18 million people acutely food insecure and 5 million facing starvation, according to the World Food Program.
Yeah. And as some people are saying here, the quiet part out loud, the RSF is supported by the UAE and the West. Yes, that's exactly right. Horrible crisis, obviously, where you have essentially a civil war between the top general and his second in command in a power struggle, the latest in a series of military coups that have basically defined the political history of Sudan for quite some time. They have had a long history of this, and part of it is because they are near, a resource-rich part of the world, and so it is somewhat of a proxy and a power struggle between other neighboring countries in the region, Iran and Egypt and the UAE in this case. But you see the devastating human toll that this has taken on people and the lack of aid getting in. And I do think that there should be actions to pressure the UN to get more aid into there, to make that at least try and lessen this just massive scale of human suffering. I mean, the numbers there are staggering. But before we go, we have a little more. But Russell, do you have anything to add for here?
Yeah, we are going to get into this, but sure, people like Douglas Murray, they want to bring up Sudan as a deflection from Gaza. One, we're not funding this in that way. Now, there may be a twisted web of involvement, but literally we cut off Israel tomorrow. Israel is not going to exist for very much longer. I mean, literally just completely cut them off militarily, financially. So we have a very obvious, very explainable, very comprehensible, and very direct complicity in what Israel does. Whereas this, what connection the West has to what's happening there is harder to explain to people. I mean, I'm explaining why it's harder to get people involved in this. Now, is there also, because it is the center of three major world religions, there's an interest in the region that Israel and Gaza are in that there is not with Sudan? Sure. You do not have a lot of Sudanese people with very strong feelings about this living in the West. There is no large contingent of Sudanese to draw attention to this in the Western world. So those are a few of the reasons. That having been said, yeah, it is a failing that we have not drawn more attention to this. So this segment is partly an attempt to correct that.
Yeah, because we got called out by this guy who really cares about Sudan a great deal.
Yeah, he gives a shit.
Douglas Murray. So this is a tweet from Cat Canada, who tweeted out a portion of the monk debate in which Douglas Murray says the only reason that kids are protesting Israel and not Sudan is, well, you take a guess.
If you didn't throng the streets of this city or any other for the actual genocide going on in Sudan, not the one that Mady and Gideon pretend is happening, but the actual genocide going on in Sudan, if you didn't spend weekend after weekend doing that, but you did come out for the post-October the 7th protests, you're an anti-Semite.
There's the explanation. Of course, as Russell said, Sudan is not our aircraft carrier. Okay, we are not involved in this to nearly the extent that we are in the Israeli genocide. And yes, there have been
we are
mass
not directly
atrocities.
Funding and supplying one side. If we were doing that, yes, you would have massive protests. Now, look, we always want to keep it real. Would they be on the scale? I don't think so. For the reasons that I laid out. We do not have as many people from that part of the world woven into Western civilization, whereas our culture has much more focus on that part of the world than it does on Sudan. But would you have much more attention paid to it if the United States were directly funding it? Yeah, I believe so.
Also, this was a conflict that arose from a top general and his second in command. It's horrible. The human rights violations being committed by the RSF, which are backed by the UAE, yes, those are horrible. And those are genocidal in nature. I would not argue that. But this is a war. This is a conflict. Right. This is not an imprisoned population being shot like fish in a barrel. Occupied by our ally being shot like fish in a barrel with no semblance of a fight. That's another key difference. That's
another thing. You have a civil war between different factions in a country that is not a client state of ours.
Right.
It's a completely different situation. That having been said, yes, a humanitarian crisis is a humanitarian crisis. And
of course,
we do need to draw attention to it and try to help in any way that we can.
Yes, absolutely true. And I want to just, as a final piece on this, Caitlin Johnston, sure, I have comments about Sudan. I think it's very interesting that Empire simps want me to talk about Sudan instead of the crimes in Gaza that are being actively facilitated by the empire I live under. I think it's very revealing that these same Empire simps never want to talk about how the UAE, effectively a member state of their beloved empire, is backing the RSF in Sudan. And I think this "what about Sudan" shtick that Empire simps and Israel apologists have been doing sounds a whole lot like stop criticizing the crimes of the white people in the power structure you're part of, criticize those brown people in Africa instead. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Listen,
That sounds
Caitlin,
about
you
right.
you can use all the Yiddish you want. They're still going to call you an anti-Semite.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Don't
There's
try
no
it.
escaping that shtick. She used that pretty well, though, because that is true. That is true. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, look, a humanitarian crisis is a humanitarian crisis. The people who are starving and being killed and being driven from their homes, obviously, that's the same all across the board. As for the weaponization of this issue by cynical scumbags like Douglas Murray, who I promise you could give a shit about the Sudan any more than he cares.
Why doesn't he go to
about Gaza.
Sudan?
Right.
He cares
Yeah,
so much
exactly.
about it. We could say the same thing about you. Why don't you go to Sudan?
Yeah, why don't you go to Sudan?
Are you anti-black?
Right.
I mean, he is, clearly.
Right. Yeah. In his case, he is.
I can answer my own question.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. The point could just be made exactly the same in the other direction.
Please clap.